His opinion of Nastasia Philippovna was settled, otherwise, naturally, everything in her would now have seemed mysterious and incomprehensible. But he sincerely believed that she could still rise. He had said quite correctly to Yevgeny Pavlovich that he sincerely and fully loved her, and his love for her indeed consisted in being drawn, as it were, towards some pitiful and sick child whom it was difficult and even impossible to abandon to its own will. He did not explain his feelings for her to anyone and even did not like talking about it, if it was impossible to avoid talking, and when he and Nastasia Philippovna sat together, they never discussed feelings, as if they had both promised not to. Anyone could take part in their ordinary, cheerful, and animated conversation. Darya Alexeyevna said afterwards that she had simply admired and rejoiced looking at them all that while. But this view he had of the state of Nastasia Philippovna's soul and mind delivered him in part from many other perplexities. This was now a completely different woman from the one he had known some 3 months earlier. He did not brood, for instance, on why she had run away from marrying him then, with tears, curses, and reproaches, but now insisted herself on a speedy marriage. It means she's not afraid, as she was then, that marrying her would be his unhappiness, thought the prince. Such quickly reborn self-assurance could not, in his view, be natural to her. Nor, again, could this assurance come only from hatred of Aglaya. Nastasia Philippovna was capable of somewhat deeper feelings. Nor from fear of facing her life with Rogozhin. In short, all these reasons, together with the rest, might have had a share in it, but the clearest thing of all for him was that it was precisely what he had long suspected, and that the poor, sick soul had been unable to endure. All this, though it delivered him, in a way, from perplexities, could not give him either peace or rest all that time. Sometimes he tried not to think about anything. It did seem, in fact, that he looked upon marriage as some sort of unimportant formality. He valued his own fate much too cheaply. With regard to objections, to conversations, such as the one with Yevgeny Pavlovich, here he could say decidedly nothing in reply and felt himself totally incompetent, and therefore he avoided all conversations of that sort. He noticed, however, that Nastasia Philippovna knew and understood only too well what Aglaya meant to him. She did not say anything, but he saw her face at those times when she occasionally caught him, in the beginning, on the point of going to the Epanchins. When the Epanchins left, she really brightened. Unobservant and unsuspecting as the prince was, he had been worried by the thought that Nastasia Philippovna might venture upon some scandal in order to drive Aglaya out of Pavlovsk. The noise and rumble about the wedding in all the dachas was, of course, partly maintained by Nastasia Philippovna in order to annoy her rival. Since it was difficult to meet the Epanchins, Nastasia Philippovna put the prince into the carriage once and gave orders that they be driven right past the windows of their dacha. This was a terrible surprise for the prince. He realized it, as usual, when it was impossible to do anything about it and the carriage was already driving right past the windows. He did not say anything, but was ill for 2 days afterwards. Nastasia Philippovna did not repeat the experiment again. In the last days before the wedding she began to lapse into deep thought. She always ended by overcoming her sadness and becoming merry again, but somehow more quietly, not so noisily, not so happily merry as before, still so recently. The prince redoubled his attention. He was curious why she never spoke to him about Rogozhin. Only once, some 5 days before the wedding, Darya Alexeyevna suddenly sent for him to come immediately, because Nastasia Philippovna was very unwell. He found her in a state resembling total madness. She was exclaiming, trembling, crying that Rogozhin was hiding in the garden, in their own house, that she had just seen him, that he was going to kill her in the night, put a knife in her. She could not calm down the whole day. But that same evening, when the prince stopped at Hippolyte's for a moment, the captain's widow, who had just come back from town, where she had gone on some little errands of her own, told them that Rogozhin had called on her that day in her apartment in Petersburg and questioned her about Pavlovsk. When the prince asked precisely when Rogozhin had called, the captain's widow named almost the same hour when Nastasia Philippovna had supposedly seen him that day in her garden. The matter was explained as a simple mirage. Nastasia Philippovna herself went to the captain's widow for more detail and was extremely comforted. On the eve of the wedding, the prince left Nastasia Philippovna in great animation. The next day's finery had arrived from the dressmaker in Petersburg, the wedding dress, the headpiece, etc., etc. The prince had not expected that she would be so excited over the finery. He praised everything himself, and his praise made her still happier. But she let something slip. She had heard that there was indignation in town and that some scapegraces were indeed arranging a charivari, with music and all, but with verses written specially for the occasion, and that it was all but approved of by the rest of society. And so now she precisely wanted to hold her head still higher before them, to outshine them all with the taste and wealth of her finery. Let them shout, let them whistle, if they dare. The mere thought of it made her eyes flash. She had yet another secret thought, but she did not voice it aloud. She dreamed that Aglaya, or at least someone sent by her, would also be in the crowd, incognito, in the church, would look and see, and she was inwardly preparing herself for that. She parted from the prince, all taken up with these thoughts, at about 11 o'clock in the evening, but before it struck midnight, a messenger came running to the prince from Darya Alexeyevna saying, "Come quickly, it's very bad." The prince found his fiancée locked in the bedroom, in tears, in despair, in hysterics. For a long time she refused to listen to anything they said to her through the locked door. At last she opened it, let in only the prince, locked the door after him, and fell on her knees before him. So, at least, Darya Alexeyevna reported afterwards, having managed to spy out a thing or two. What am I doing? What am I doing? What am I doing to you? She kept exclaiming, convulsively embracing his legs. The prince stayed for a whole hour with her. We do not know what they talked about. According to Darya Alexeyevna, they parted after an hour, reconciled and happy. The prince sent once more that night to inquire, but Nastasia Philippovna was already asleep. In the morning, before she woke up, 2 more messengers came to Darya Alexeyevna's from the prince, and a third was instructed to tell him that Nastasia Philippovna is now surrounded by a whole swarm of dressmakers and hairdressers from Petersburg, that there was no trace of yesterday's mood, that she was occupied as only such a beauty could be occupied with dressing for her wedding, and that now, precisely at that moment, an extraordinary congress was being held about precisely which of the diamonds to wear and how to wear them. The prince was completely set at ease. The whole following story about this wedding was told by knowledgeable people in the following way and seems to be correct. The wedding was set for 8 o'clock in the evening. Nastasia Filipovna was ready by 7. From 6 o'clock on, crowds of idlers gradually began to gather around Lebedev's dacha, but more especially near Darya Alexeyevna's house. After 7 o'clock the church also began to fill up. Vera Lebedev and Kolya were terribly afraid for the prince. However, they were very busy at home. They were responsible for the reception and refreshments in the prince's rooms. However, almost no real gathering was planned after the wedding. Besides the necessary persons present at the church ceremony, Lebedev had invited the Tissins, Ganya, the doctor with an Anna on his neck, and Darya Alexeyevna. When the curious prince asked Lebedev why he had decided to invite the doctor, almost a total stranger, Lebedev answered self-contentedly. An order on his neck, a respectable man, for appearances, sir, and made the prince laugh. Keller and Burdovsky, in tailcoats and gloves, looked very proper, only Keller still worried the prince and his own backers slightly by his open propensity for battle and the very hostile look he gave the idlers who were gathering around the house. Finally, at 7:30, the prince set out for the church in a carriage. We will note, incidentally, that he himself purposely did not want to leave out any of the usual habits and customs. Everything was done publicly, obviously, openly, and as it should be.